The parking garage ticket was still in my jacket pocket when the hospital called. Level 3, space 47, 11,018 AM. I know the exact space because I'd texted my wife a photo of the parking sign so she wouldn't forget where I parked when she came to meet me after her ultrasound. We were supposed to grab lunch at that taco place on Lamar she'd been craving for 3 weeks. She never made it to the car. My name is Connor Hale. I'm 32 years old, former Army Ranger, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Syria, and until 14 months ago, I thought the worst thing I'd ever survive was watching my buddy Jessup bleed out in a drainage ditch outside Mosul. I was wrong about that. My wife's name is Paige. She was 30 weeks pregnant with our son when they found her unconscious in the parking garage of St. David's Medical Center in Austin, Texas. 3 broken ribs, a fractured orbital socket, blunt force trauma to the abdomen. The attending physician used the word miracle when he told me our son survived, and I have never hated a word more in my life, because miracles don't happen to people who deserve what happened to her. The call came at 12:41 p.m. I was sitting in a conference room in my office building, half listening to a quarterly review presentation, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I almost did. Sir, is this Connor Hale? Yes. Your wife has been transported to St. David's Medical Center. She was found unresponsive in the parking structure. You need to come now. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember saying anything to my coworkers. My supervisor told me later I just walked straight out of the room mid-sentence, still holding my coffee. The drive from downtown to the hospital should take 11 minutes. I made it in 6. I parked illegally in a fire lane and did not care even slightly. A detective was already there waiting for me in the ER hallway. Her name was Detective Flores, and she had the kind of quiet, measured voice that people learn specifically for delivering terrible news. She told me the parking garage cameras had caught 2 men approaching my wife near the elevators on level 2. One of them struck her from behind with what appeared to be a telescoping baton. The other one went through her purse, took her phone, her keys, her wallet. Then they took their time walking to a white Ford pickup and leaving. They did not rush. That's the part that stayed with me. Detective Flores used the phrase unhurried exit. They hit a pregnant woman until she was unconscious on a concrete floor, and then they walked slowly to their truck like they'd just finished pumping gas. I asked to see the footage. She showed me. I watched my wife crumple. I watched her try to curl around her stomach on the way down. Even unconscious, she was trying to protect him. I handed Detective Flores back her tablet and I walked to the men's room and I stayed in there for 4 minutes. That's all I let myself have. When I came out, I was calm. Ranger calm, the kind of calm that lives underneath everything else and doesn't feel like peace. It feels like ice. The doctor's name was Dr. Anand. He had kind eyes and he did not make me wait long before he found me. He said Paige was stable, which was the best word I'd ever heard, and then he walked me through what stable meant. The baby's heartbeat was strong, but she had a subdural hematoma they were monitoring, and the orbital fracture would require surgery, and the rib injuries meant breathing was going to be painful for weeks. He said they wanted to keep her sedated overnight to reduce intracranial pressure. He said I could sit with her. She looked so small in that bed. Paige is not a small woman. She ran half marathons before the pregnancy. She argues with contractors for a living. She's a project manager for a commercial construction firm, and she has never once in our 5 years together backed down from anything. But in that bed with the monitors and the swelling already darkening her face, she looked like someone had reached in and taken something essential out of her. I held her hand and I talked to her about nothing. I told her about the quarterly meeting. I told her the breakfast tacos at the place on Lamar were going to wait for us. I told her our son was still in there fighting and that he got that from her. Around 9 p.m., I stepped into the hallway and called my mother-in-law. Her name is Sandra, and there is no soft way to say this. She is one of the most formidable people I have ever encountered in my life, and I was an Army Ranger. She spent 23 years as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Western District of Texas before she retired. She prosecuted cartel cases. She put men away who had entire legal teams in the patience of people who think in decades. She is 61 years old and she walks into rooms the way weather systems do. She and I have not always had an easy relationship. When Paige and I got married, Sandra made it politely but unmistakably clear that she had questions about whether a former soldier with a logistics job and a 2-bedroom apartment in South Austin was the right fit for her daughter. We found a way to coexist. We had Thanksgiving together and kept our distance the rest of the time. That night in the hospital hallway, I called her and I said, "Mom, I never call her that. I always call her Sandra. I think she knew from that one word before I said anything else. She was at the hospital in 40 minutes. She lives in Round Rock. She must have driven the same way I did. She came around the corner of the hallway in a blazer she'd clearly thrown on over pajama pants, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked like she didn't know what to do with her hands. She stood in the doorway of Paige's room for a moment, and I saw her do what I had done in the men's room. Take 4 minutes. Come back out the other side. Then she turned to me and said, "Tell me everything Detective Flores told you, and tell me what was in that footage." So I did. By the time I finished, Sandra's jaw was set in a way I recognized from Thanksgiving arguments. She pulled out her phone and started making a list. 2 days passed in the specific hell of hospital waiting rooms and vending machine coffee and sleeping in a recliner next to my wife's bed. Paige woke up on the morning of the second day. She reached for my hand before she opened her eyes, which is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She remembered almost nothing about the attack. She remembered pulling into the garage. She remembered the elevator doors opening. She remembered thinking the light on level 2 was always bad and that someone should report it to the hospital. Then nothing until the sound of my voice. We cried. We held each other as carefully as we could around the tubes and the monitors. She put my hand on her stomach and our son kicked, and I had to leave the room for another 4 minutes. Detective Flores came by that afternoon with an update. The white Ford pickup had been found abandoned behind a strip mall in Ploufragerville. Stolen plates. No useful prints. The facial recognition from the garage cameras had returned one partial hit, a man named Troy Vasquez, 34, with prior arrests for aggravated assault and weapons possession, last known address in Del Valle. His associate was still unidentified. Here is what Detective Flores did not say out loud, but what I understood from 20 years of watching people choose their words carefully. Troy Vasquez was not just a mugger. The name meant something to someone in that building, and the way she paused before she said it told me she was deciding how much to share. That evening, Sandra came back to the hospital with a leather folder and 2 coffees, and the expression she usually reserved for opposing counsel. She sat across from me in the hallway, and she said, "I need to tell you something about Troy Vasquez." She'd spent the 2 days I'd been in the recliner making phone calls. Old colleagues, former U.S. Marshals she'd worked with, a contact at the DEA office in Austin. Troy Vasquez was a known associate of a distribution network operating out of South Austin and into the Hill Country, a mid-level operation with cartel connections out of Nuevo Laredo. Not headline news, but persistent. The kind of operation that had been investigated 3 times in 5 years and come out clean each time because witnesses either recanted or relocated, and because at least 2 people in the Travis County system had historically shown a remarkable tolerance for missing evidence. I asked her if she was telling me that someone sent those men to that garage. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "I'm telling you what I know. The investigation is Detective Flores's." I said, "But you have a theory." She said, "I have several." Then she told me about a case she had prosecuted 9 years ago, before she retired. A man named Felix Garza, who ran distribution for the same network Troy Vasquez was connected to. He went away for 14 years. He'd been out for 11 months. I asked why that mattered. She set down her coffee and said, "Because Paige testified." I felt the floor shift. Paige was 22 when it happened, Sandra told me. She'd been at a gas station off Ben White at 2 a.m. after a late shift waitressing. She'd witnessed a delivery. She hadn't understood what she was seeing, not entirely, but she'd seen enough to describe it. She'd called a tip line. She'd agreed to testify. She'd sat in a federal courtroom and pointed at Felix Garza and said what she saw. She never told me. 5 years married, 3 years dating before that, and she had never once told me. Sandra said, "She didn't tell anyone. She was terrified and she thought it was over. When I asked her why she didn't tell you, she said she didn't want the past inside her life." I sat in that hallway for a long time without saying anything. Then I called my old team sergeant, a man named Wes, who had driven 8 hours from his place outside San Antonio for no reason other than that I'd sent him a text that said something happened and he'd gotten in his truck before I finished the sentence. I found him in the hospital cafeteria eating a granola bar and reading a paperback. I told him everything. He finished his granola bar and he said, "Okay, what do you need?" What I needed was information, and I needed it faster than Detective Flores's case was moving. I want to be precise about what came next, because I have heard the word vigilante applied to it, and that is not accurate. We did not cross lines. We did not touch anyone. What we did was what Rangers do. We gathered intelligence. We documented everything, and we handed it to people with authority to act on it. Wes called 2 men from our old battalion. One was a guy named Breck, who now worked private security and knew how to run surveillance without being seen. The other was a guy named Tate, who had a background in signals intelligence and could cross-reference phone records, location data, and public business filings in a way that was entirely legal and entirely effective. They arrived within 36 hours. We set up a base of operations in the extended stay hotel 2 blocks from the hospital so I could be near Paige. Sandra, meanwhile, was running her own track. She contacted a former colleague at the U.S. Attorney's Office, a woman she'd mentored named Deputy U.S. Attorney Christine Park. She did not ask Christine to do anything improper. She asked her to look at whether the Felix Garza case had any open threads and whether the current distribution network his associates were running had crossed state lines in a way that would support federal jurisdiction. It had. It had crossed state lines repeatedly. There were transactions in Oklahoma and New Mexico. There was a storage facility in El Paso that had been flagged twice. Christine Park called Sandra back in 18 hours. She said, "I'm looking at this." Tate pulled Troy Vasquez's digital footprint from legally obtainable public records and a few sources I will not specify. What emerged was a picture of a man who had been doing low-level enforcement work for the network for 4 years, collections, intimidation, the occasional message sent via property destruction. He reported to a man named Darren Quill, who ran the Austin side of the operation out of a legitimate-looking landscaping company in Kyle, Texas. Breck ran physical surveillance on the landscaping company for 3 days. He documented vehicle traffic, photographed license plates, tracked a cargo van that made a run to a storage unit off I-35 in San Marcos, all of it handed directly to Christine Park's office. On the 4th day, Troy Vasquez made a mistake. He used a cell phone registered to a family member to call a number connected to Darren Quill. Tate flagged it. The call lasted 6 minutes. We handed the data to Christine Park. She handed it to an FBI field agent in Austin named Special Agent Morales, who had been building a RICO case on the network for 2 years and had been waiting for a single provable act of violence connected to leadership. A pregnant woman beaten in a hospital parking garage, connected by witness history to Felix Garza, connected by phone records to Darren Quill through Troy Vasquez. That was the thread. Special Agent Morales pulled on it. I was back in Paige's room when the arrest started. She was sitting up for the first time, eating Jell-O and watching a cooking show with the sound on low. Her right eye was still swollen nearly shut. The orbital surgery was scheduled for the following morning. She had not yet seen herself in a mirror, which was her choice, and I was not going to suggest otherwise. Sandra called me from the hallway. I stepped out. Troy Vasquez was in federal custody. His associate, identified from garage footage cross-reference with DMV records, a man named Bobby Rice, had been picked up at a motel in Buda. Darren Quill had been arrested at his house in Kyle at 6 a.m. while his sprinkler system was running. Felix Garza had a warrant out and was believed to be moving toward the border. They caught Garza at a checkpoint outside Laredo 18 hours later. He was in the back seat of the pickup truck with a bag containing $47,000 cash and a prepaid phone with 6 messages between him and Darren Quill discussing what was described as the Austin problem. Paige was the Austin problem. Sandra came into the room to tell Paige herself. I stood in the corner and watched my mother-in-law, this woman who had looked at me like a question mark for 5 years, sit on the edge of my wife's hospital bed and take her hand and say, "It is over. They have all of them." Paige didn't cry right away. She just looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she said, "I should have told you." Sandra said, "You were protecting what you built. I understand that." Paige looked at me. I pulled my chair close and I held her hand and I said, "You did right 9 years ago. You did the hard thing alone. I'm sorry I wasn't there then. I'm here now." She squeezed my hand. Our son kicked. The orbital surgery went well. 3 days later, Paige was discharged in a wheelchair with printed instructions about activity restrictions, pain management, and signs to watch for in the remaining 10 weeks of the pregnancy. Wes pushed the wheelchair to the car because he insisted, and Breck carried the flowers, and Tate drove because we had a baby seat to install, and he was the only one of us who had ever successfully installed one on the first try. Sandra drove separately. When we got to her house, she had already been there. There was soup in the refrigerator and labeled containers, and the guest room was made up because she was staying for 2 weeks, and she had decided this without asking either of us, which was so purely her that I found myself unable to argue. Paige looked at the soup containers and at the guest room, and at her mother standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, and the closest thing to uncertain I had ever seen on that woman's face, and she said, "Thank you, Mom." Sandra nodded briskly and said, "You need to eat more protein." Then she disappeared into the kitchen. I followed her. I stood next to her at the counter while she reorganized the spice drawer, which did not need reorganizing. I said, "Sandra." She didn't look up. I said, "Thank you. For Christine. For all of it." She paused with a jar of cumin in her hand. She said, "You kept your head? That matters. A lot of people in that situation don't." I said, "I had good training." She said, "So did I." We stood there for a moment. Then she went back to the spice drawer and I went back to Paige. The federal case moved fast, the way they do when the evidence is overwhelming and the defense attorneys look at the discovery file and start having quiet conversations with their clients about cooperation. Darren Quill flipped inside 3 weeks. He gave up supply chain details, banking structures, the names of 2 local officials who had received payments over the course of 4 years. The indictment expanded from 4 defendants to 19. The RICO charges meant asset freezes, which meant the landscaping company in Kyle was padlocked within a month. Troy Vasquez's public defender tried to argue that the attack on Paige was unconnected to the network, a random robbery. The garage footage, the phone records, the testimony of 2 cooperating witnesses, and the fact that Paige had testified against Felix Garza 9 years earlier made that argument very short. Vasquez took a plea. 14 years federal. Bobby Rice took a plea for 8 years. Felix Garza went to trial. He was 60 years old and he had done this before and he believed, I think, that he would do it again. The prosecutor called Paige as a witness. She had been home for 6 weeks by then. Our son had been born 3 weeks before the trial date, 2 weeks early, but healthy and loud in a way that Wes said meant he would be trouble, and Tate said meant he had good lungs. His name is Archer. I sat in the front row of the courtroom when Paige testified. She walked in without a cane. The orbital surgery had healed cleanly and the bruising was gone. You could see a faint discoloration along her cheekbone if you knew to look. She sat in the witness box and she looked at the jury and she spoke clearly and without hesitation about what she had seen on Ben White 22 years ago and what she had seen in the parking garage and what it meant to survive both. Felix Garza looked at her once. Just once. She looked back and she did not blink. The jury took 6 hours, guilty on all counts. Conspiracy, racketeering, witness retaliation, conspiracy to commit assault. The judge denied bail pending sentencing and said the word premeditated 3 times in under 2 minutes. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. 22 years, no parole eligibility for 18. Sandra was in the second row. When the verdict was read, she did not make a sound. She sat perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap and she exhaled very slowly through her nose. The way you do when something you have been holding for a long time finally sets down. After the sentencing, we went to dinner at a place Paige had been wanting to try for months. It was the 4 of us, me and Paige and Sandra and Archer and his carrier, making small, serious noises at the ceiling. Wes and Breck and Tate had gone home by then. Wes had called me 2 days after the arrests, when things were clearly in the hands of people with badges and subpoena power, and said, "You good?" I said, "Getting there." He said, "That's all it is." And he drove back to San Antonio. At dinner, Sandra held Archer for the first time. Paige had offered before, and Sandra had always found a reason to defer. The timing wasn't right. She didn't want to disturb him if he was sleeping. She'd wait until he was a little bigger. But that night, she just reached across the table, and Paige placed him in her arms, and Sandra looked down at him with an expression I had never seen on her face before. He grabbed her finger. She laughed, a real laugh, not the polite one she used for social occasions. It changed her entire face. She said, "He has your chin, Connor." I said, "Everyone keeps telling me that." Paige said, "He has my stubbornness." Sandra said, "Good. He'll need it." We drove home with Archer asleep in his seat and Paige's hand on my knee and the radio on low. The city moved past the windows. I thought about Felix Garza in a federal holding facility. I thought about Paige at 22, sitting alone in a federal courtroom, pointing at a man who frightened her, doing it anyway. I thought about what it costs people to do the right thing and how rarely anyone accounts for that cost. The week after the sentencing, Sandra drove over unannounced, which was becoming a pattern, and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and a yellow legal pad. She told us she had spent 3 weeks speaking with Christine Park and 2 victim advocacy organizations about a gap she'd identified in how witness protection resources were allocated in federal cases. Specifically, the period after testimony, after the conviction, after the case is officially closed, when the threat is supposedly gone, but the witness is still living with the weight of what they did and the fear that it isn't really over. She had drafted a proposal for a fund attached to the Western District of Texas Bar Association. It would provide security assessments for witnesses post-trial, relocation consultation for those who needed it, and a legal support line for situations where a witness felt threatened and didn't know who to call. She slid the legal pad across the table. At the top, she had written a name, The Archer Project. Paige looked at the name and then at her mother, and she said, "Mom." Sandra said, "It's a working title. We can change it." Paige said, "Don't change it." Paige said, "Don't change it." I looked at Sandra across the table, this woman who had looked at me like an unresolved question for half a decade, and I said, "What do you need from us?" She said, "Your name. And Connor, I want to know if any of your contacts at Veterans Affairs would be willing to consult on security assessments, people who understand threat environments." I said yes before she finished the sentence. Christine Park agreed to co-sponsor the proposal. 2 weeks later, it was submitted to the Bar Association. A retired federal judge agreed to serve on the oversight board. Wes flew up from San Antonio for the initial meeting, which was not required of him, but that's who Wes is. Breck provided a template for the security assessment protocols based on his private sector work. 6 months after Paige came home from the hospital, the Archer Project had its first intake. A woman in her late 20s from El Paso who had testified in a trafficking case 2 years earlier and had been receiving what she described as visits from people she didn't recognize near her apartment. She called the legal support line on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she had a security assessment and 2 attorneys reviewing her options. I drove Paige to the meeting. Archer was with Sandra, who kept a portable crib at her condo now. A fact that Paige mentioned very carefully, like she wasn't sure how I would take it. I told her it was the best development in years. In the car on the way home, Paige was quiet for a while. The highway stretched ahead of us through the hill country, scrub oak and limestone in the early spring, and the sky doing what Texas skies do in March. That particular shade of blue that doesn't exist anywhere else. She said, "Do you think she's going to be okay?" "The woman from El Paso," I said. She called the line. "That's the hardest part." Paige nodded. She said, "I know." She looked out the window. She had a small scar near her right temple, barely visible now. She didn't hide it. She wore her hair back more often than she used to. She said, "I keep thinking about what would have happened if the garage camera had been offline, or if Flores hadn't flagged the Vasquez connection, or if your mom hadn't called Christine." I said, "But it wasn't offline." And she did. Paige said, "I know. I just think about the version where none of that was there." I said, "Then we make sure more people have what we had." She reached over and put her hand on mine on the center console. We drove the rest of the way home through the hill country in the kind of quiet that isn't empty. The kind that's full of things you don't need to say out loud because the person next to you already knows. Archer was asleep in Sandra's arms when we got back. Sandra was watching the news with the volume at 2, which I had come to understand was her version of peace. She handed him to me, without waking him, and then she straightened her blazer and she picked up her car keys from the counter. At the door, she paused. She said, "The Vasquez sentencing memo is posted. 14 years, federal, no early eligibility. I saw it this morning." I said, "Good." She said, "Yes." She looked at Archer. Then she looked at me. Then she left. Paige was watching from the couch. She said, "She likes you." I said, "She tolerates me professionally." Paige smiled. She said, "For her, that's the same thing." I sat down beside her with Archer on my chest. He made a small sound and settled. The house was quiet. Outside, Austin kept going. Traffic on the overpass, a dog barking somewhere 2 streets over. The ordinary sound of a city that doesn't know and doesn't need to know what happens in the margins, in the parking garages, in the quiet rooms where people decide whether to speak or stay silent. Paige had spoken. Twice. Once at 22, alone and frightened, and once in a federal courtroom with our son 10 days old at home and her mother in the second row and me in the first. The men who thought fear was a permanent condition were in federal custody. The rest of us were here, building something out of what they'd left behind. Archer grabbed my finger in his sleep, same as he'd grabbed Sandra's at dinner. His grip was unreasonable for a person his size. Paige said it meant he was going to be strong. Sandra said it meant he had good reflexes. Wes said it meant he was definitely going to be trouble. I think they're all right. If you had been in my position that night in the hospital hallway with everything burning down, would you have made the same call? Would you have trusted the system, or would you have trusted the people who knew you? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Hit like if you believe the people who speak up deserve to be protected, not just thanked. Subscribe if you want to keep following cases where doing the right thing actually means something. And drop your city or state below. I want to know where you're watching from. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that day. Not in any grand cosmic sense, just the plain mechanical truth that every action sets something else in motion, and people who operate on fear as their primary tool tend to forget that fear runs in both directions. Felix Garza waited 9 years. He sat in a federal prison, and he calculated, and he planned. And when he got out, he made a decision that he believed was untraceable. He targeted a woman he thought was unprotected. A young mother. A wife. Someone who had done the right thing once, alone, without fanfare, and then gotten on with her life. He thought that made her soft. He thought the distance of 9 years had dissolved whatever consequences might follow. What he didn't account for was what Paige had built in those 9 years. Not walls. Not weapons. Just a life, a husband who had been trained to stay calm under the worst conditions imaginable, a mother-in-law who had spent 2 decades learning exactly how men like Felix Garza operated and exactly which threads to pull to unravel them, and a network of people who showed up not because it was their job, but because that's what you do when someone you love needs you. I think about Sandra a lot when I think about this. She and I spent 5 years being politely wary of each other, and honestly, for most of that time, I think we were each other's blind spot. She saw a soldier who traded structure for stubbornness and called it independence. I saw a woman who measured everything and called it care. We were both partially right and mostly missing the point. When it mattered, she didn't hesitate. Not for a single hour. She made calls, she pulled files, she found Christine Park, she built the chain of evidence that gave the FBI what they needed. She did it because Paige was her daughter, yes. But she also did it because it was right. And she had the knowledge and the discipline and the history to make right actually mean something beyond a feeling. That's what I keep coming back to. Doing the right thing isn't enough on its own. Paige did the right thing at 22, and she still ended up on a concrete floor in a parking garage 9 years later. What changes the outcome isn't just the intention. It's the preparation, the relationships, the willingness to stay sharp and stay connected even when everything is quiet and nothing seems to require it. Sandra had spent 23 years building expertise that looked from the outside like a career. From the inside, it turned out to be a shield she didn't know she was making for her daughter. Wes drove 8 hours on a text. Breck and Tade flew in on a phone call. Not because I'm special, because we had spent years being the kind of people who showed up for each other. And when you do that consistently, it becomes the thing that saves you when saving is required. Archer is 14 months old now. He doesn't know any of this yet. He will someday, and when he does, I want him to understand not just what happened, but why it ended the way it did. Not luck, not fate. The accumulated weight of choices made by people who decided over and over that doing the hard thing was worth the cost. Even when no one was watching, even when the threat felt distant, even when it would have been easier to stay quiet and move on. His grandmother held him at dinner the night the verdict came down, and she laughed for real for the first time I'd ever witnessed. That image is worth more to me than the sentencing. The sentencing was justice. That laugh was proof that something had survived and grown and was going to keep going. That's what the people who use fear as a weapon never seem to understand. They can interrupt a life. They cannot end what a life has already built.